Hello, I'm Sudipto Mondal, and welcome to What's Your Ism? It's a show about political ideologies and theories of change in an increasingly volatile and ever-changing world. Now, those of you who follow this show, I'm sure, are aware that what we are focused on is what's vital and not what's viral. The activists, thinkers, authors, lawyers, journalists, and intellectuals we've featured on this show have left me more educated, and I hope that's been your experience too. The show is also built on things I learned through several years as a field reporter. In all these years, I've traveled to different parts of the country and the world to understand people and their political motivations. If you think that my physical and mental labor brings value to your life, if you find yourself educated by this show, please consider compensating the News Minute for the people and infrastructure they've invested in a show like this. You could also directly fund the production of What's Your Ism by paying whatever amount you think is appropriate directly by scanning this QR code. Hello and welcome to What's Your Ism? I'm Sudipto Mondal. Today we are going to discuss Umar Khalid and his ism through his friends and comrades Banojyotsna Lahiri, Anirban Bhattacharya and Shuddhabrata Sengupta. They have put together a collection of writings on and around the incarceration of Umar Khalid. The book also has pieces by Umar, including his letters from jail. The book is called Umar Khalid and His World and it has been published by the 3 Essays Collective. Anirban, Banojyotsna, Shuddhabrata, welcome to What's Your Ism? Thank you very much for agreeing to come on this show, wading through Delhi traffic, getting to the Newslaundry studio. Thanks for being on this show. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you for having us.
Thanks for having us.
You came to Bangalore and I got this book from you guys. I got it signed. This is what the discussion is today about. Umar Khalid and His World. You guys went anywhere else apart from Bangalore for the readings? How has the book been received? Before we get into all this question of isms and all that, how is the book done?
The book has been doing pretty well so far. We did the first launch in Delhi, and then we did one big launch in Bangalore where you also were there, and we did also a book reading session in Bangalore in one of the bookshops in North Bangalore. And then in Delhi also in the bookshop we had a reading session. So far Bangalore and Delhi we have done. We are planning to do it in Calcutta, Hyderabad, Mumbai and other cities. Chennai.
Right. So far, no men with guns walking in.
No, so far
How's the
no.
reception?
Yeah. On the contrary, a lot of very good book sales. I think everywhere where we've done events, the books have been sold out. The repeated requests from the shops. So the book is doing well, and that's a good sign because it means that a lot of people are engaging with it.
Quite a few good reviews have also come. We were really touched by some of the reviews which were very good.
Right. So, what we're going to try and do today is divide this thing in broadly 2 parts. I think, for starters, given that the context is Umar Khalid, I want to obviously take that also as a starting point and go into all these conversations about what was happening in 2016. Shuddhabrata, I was reading your memories and your interactions with Anirban and Umar going back 10 years before, which is 2010s, I think, early 2010s or something. So I want to go into all of that. But for starters, I want to take some time to turn this into a sort of vigil for Umar by doing a set of readings. I can suggest some sections if you'd like, if you have some sections in your mind. And once you do that, I want to also... So I've known Anirban and Banojyotsna because of their work with BASO back then, and I was visiting Delhi, so I have a sense of their interactions with Umar and that whole combine. So Shuddhabrata, your interactions with Umar is also something you write about. Once we do this reading about the FIRs, I want to get into these things that you describe as tangential angularities in our political outlook. And that will set some background in. Anyway, can we pick a section?
Yeah. So I'll read from this essay called No Tyrant Can Endure, and this section called Taken into Custody. Umar Khalid has been named as an accused and arrested under a First Information Report FIR 59 of 2020, which was filed on the 6th of March. He has been charged under 4 sections of the Repulsive Unlawful Activities Prevention Act 1967, which deal with abetment, causing death, fundraising, and conspiracy. 18 sections of the Indian Penal Code, that time we still had the Indian Penal Code, not the Bharatiya Nyaya Samhita. So 18 sections of the Indian Penal Code, ranging from murder and rioting to trespassing, 2 sections of the Prevention of Damage to Public Property Act 1984, and 2 sections of the Arms Act 1959. On 14th of September, Amitabh Rawat, an additional sessions judge at the Karkarduma District Court, remanded Khalid to 10 days of police custody. According to news reports, the police told the court that they wanted to confront Umar Khalid with documents running into 11 lakh pages. The police had already questioned Umar for 5 days on the 31st of July when they seized his phone, and around 12 hours on the day of his arrest. The charge sheet in this case is expected to be filed on 17th of September. Now, it's important to understand that this piece was written and published on the 16th of September 2020. That's 3 days after Umar was arrested on 13th of September. And I keep underscoring the irony of the fact 13th September, the day he was arrested, is National Political Prisoners Day. And it has been observed as such since the time of British rule, because it commemorates the martyrdom of one of the prisoners who was an associate of Bhagat Singh in Lahore prison. So it's literally, I mean, at that time, I think we all expected that this is a farce. It's not going to run for very long. It's terrible that he has been arrested and that all these other people have been arrested. But we were looking at a short period of incarceration. Since then, it's been about it's going about to be 6 months, years this September. So it's an assessment of our incorrect idea of time at that time.
Right. There is this interesting reference. I mean, just by, anecdotes make this thing richer. There is this certain public witness Y.
Yeah.
This public witness Y is like a fly on the wall, it appears. Has ears and eyes everywhere. So this public witness Y has said what all kind of things is I think of some interest. Who is this public interest Y? Public witness Y.
Public witness Y. I mean, these X, Y, and Z get more colorful names as the case progresses. They become Alpha, Romeo, Bravo, Charlie,
Echo,
etc.
Bond.
Bond. They all,
Bond. There's a Bond also.
BOND, Bond. Yes, there's a Bond.
Bravo.
Bravo. Yes, Bravo. And they all have fascinating things to say. The problem is that they also end up contradicting both each other and themselves. So I think that there is one public witness who says, I saw him at this place at this time and meeting these other people and saying these things. And then in another statement, and these are statements given before the magistrate, he's talking about a completely different time and a different place. So there is a kind of discrepancy, what would be called, I guess nowadays in the SIR we hear about logical discrepancies. This would be a logical discrepancy in the testimonies of the protected witnesses. And also there are contradictions between the witnesses and across them. So there are many like that, yeah.
No, but I mean, in a sense, the best way to respond to them in a public way is to, find ways to joke about it, I suppose. Like there's this Amitabh Bachchan, I think it's Amitabh Bachchan only in some role, where he is this paid witness and they say, do you know this, some name, some Ram or Lakshman or something? And he said, yeah, Lakshman is like this, Lakshman is like that. And then the lawyer asked, do you know Lakshman is actually a murga? And, because they say, ki, kitna lamba tha Lakshman? Or I'm just saying Lakshman, I don't know. And he says, itna lamba. So then says, do you know it's a murga? So he takes out his other hand and says, main to agla haath nikala nahi, and all of that, But the things that come up over here make for interesting reading.
May I just say one thing here? Actually, sorry, Umar talks about the witnesses even before he is arrested. There is an article he writes in The Wire where he mentions the fact that the police is trying to create false testimonies and is pressurizing people into giving false witness even before Umar is arrested. So giving false witness.
It was a letter he wrote, open letter he wrote to the commissioner.
To the commissioner of police.
Yeah.
And I think in that he talks about the fact that one of these individuals has told Umar that he's being pressurized into giving this false witness. Yeah.
Shuddhabrata, I said I don't have much of an understanding of your engagement and how you knew Umar. I understand you were in some ways a senior mentor kind of figure, and they were youngsters who came to you in 2009, 10, these years. Give me a sense of what he was like to start with. Let's start with the origin story. What was he like in the early years? There's a section where you rush through and you say that one night you discussed the covenant of Medina, and the passion of Karbala, Ibn Arabi, and these names, these concepts give me goosebumps, because of Ibn Arabi is somebody who in the Sufi tradition is a very important figure. The covenant of Medina is a secular republic, a covenant for a secular republic is how I have heard it described. The sacrifice of Karbala, you have Imam Hussein and his murder and what it signifies and all of that. So when I read this, I read the other stuff. I know that, he's somebody who comes from the left tradition, took to Ambedkarite, politics later on, his interest in Adivasi affairs. But this gives me a more holistic picture of a person whose sampling is so wide. Give me a sense of this person a little bit from the perspective of, let's say, isms, since we call this show What's Your Ism?
Well, actually I write about it in some detail in many places. So in the same essay, No Tyrant Can Endure, I talk about the origin story. What you're describing is actually the week before his arrest. So it's September 2020, and I'll come to that. But there is, since this association goes long back, so in 2020, I write that I first came to know Umar 10 years ago, which means 2010, when he asked me a tough question from the very last row of a packed auditorium. I had spoken at an event on the situation of prisoners in under trials, especially political prisoners in India. Those were slightly different days from now. The state was even then a violent, repressive entity. The bulk of the media even then was smarmy, cynical opportunists. Higher education even then was still a mess. But the bright sparks of questions were still being ignited in campuses across India. So while things were terrible, there wasn't this abnormal clampdown on campuses. There was still a lot of conversation. That is how I met the two distinguished lady and gentleman in front of me. It was at that time and with Umar, right? Over these past 10 years, all of us, I think, have forged a friendship despite our differences in age. I've never thought while talking to Banojyotsna, Anirban or Umar that I am actually older. They make me feel much younger, right? So, and sometimes they treat me with the disdain reserved for the very young. So it's not as if I don't think the mantle of mentor doesn't quite sit well on me. But over these years, these questions have recurred. And at that time, Umar was asking, and I made an intervention at that meeting about the rights of the prisoners taken by insurgent outfits. We talked about the rights of prisoners taken by the state. But I said, even if you're fighting if people say they are fighting a war, a people's war, then there are conventions that they have to sort of abide by, even if they are insurgents. And we talked a lot about the sort of non-combatant conventions in the Vienna Convention, which India is not a signatory to. India is not a signatory to the non-combatant conventions. But I said that it might be interesting for these insurgents to say we will abide by them and we will respect the rights of prisoners as prisoners of war. And that set off an interesting kind of debate that talked about what does power do, wherever power exists. It may exist in the central government or in the state and its armed forces, but locally it may also exist in a body of armed men who are thinking they're resisting oppression. So this question of attitudes to power wherever it exists began then. And I think that has continued. Over time, there's also another section in the same essay where I talk about this is when they break away from one student organization, the Democratic Students' Union, to form the Bhagat Singh Ambedkar Student Organization, BASO. And the split takes place, in my opinion, on one of the most interesting questions, the question of love and desire, and how love and desire is to be policed or monitored within political situations. And while I am very sympathetic to how the reasons why BASO is set up, I do recall having a conversation with Umar Anirban Bhattacharya in a dhaba, I don't remember which one it was, Ganga or Sabarmati dhaba, saying that you people have to be very careful because you're the youngest and smallest of student organizations at the moment. And therefore, using you as a point of leverage to enter universities to create a climate of terror would be very easy and cost effective for the state. This was, I think, 4 to 5 months before the events of February 2016, when after a program, A Country Without a Post Office, which is a poetry reading program in JNU, there was this entire media scandal that erupted. And what was known as the phrase Tukle Tukle Gang emerged from that. We still don't know who the people who said those words were. But it seemed to me to be the fulfillment of a very uncanny prophecy that I had made inadvertently and casually, saying, be careful, you're vulnerable, you are a young, small organization, they have very little to lose, they meaning the state and the deep state especially, very little to lose if they use you as leverage to create a kind of national political scandal. And this is exactly what happened. It's after that we had many conversations. They went underground, they came back. I wrote about their return to JNU campus. I followed this whole process. The meeting that you're talking about, where we had these really amazing conversations about episodes within Islamic and Islamicate history, took place a week before Umar Khalid's arrest. And it happened when, in the course of that conversation, we said that there was a need in the wake of Shaheenbagh, in the wake of all that had happened in the past few months, that is, the winter of 2019 turning to 2020, there was a need that Umar felt for the broadening of the consciousness of the young Muslim, where resources from within the history of the faith could be also accessed to produce an emancipatory potential. And he's very concerned, and rightly so, about the fact that the question of leadership within minority communities, Muslim or Christian or others, often gets boxed into the agendas of the most reactionary and power-friendly elements within those authorities. Shaheenbagh seemed to him and to me to have opened out an opportunity for something completely different, for thinking, especially with the sentiments and the reasoning and the wishes of young women, Muslim women, and their allies, as to what a different future for an emancipatory politics from within the Muslim community could be. And that is why we talked about the Covenant of Medina, we talked about the legacy of Karbala and what it means to say, and there's a saying that every day is Ashura and all the earth is Karbala. So it's a way of remembering the question of injustice for all time. We talked about the speech that Zainab makes in the court of Yazid, where she says that I am talking about my right as a human being and as a person to remember my brother, right? So it's like an Antigone kind of speech. There are other things that we talked about throughout Islamic history, but also we talked about the modern history of Muslim communities in the subcontinent, where we talked about, let's say, Ruqayya Shekhawat Hussain or Maulana Bhashani or Hasrat Mohani, who called himself Ishtiraki Momin, a socialist Muslim or a Muslim socialist. And Hasrat Mohani is the person who gave us the phrase Inqilab Zindabad, which is one of the reasons, the repetition of that phrase is one of the reasons why Umar Khalid is in prison, because the judge thinks that saying Inqilab Zindabad is disruptive. So we are talking of creating a kind of a syllabus, a model of reading together of many things from different parts of Islamic history. That would include Malcolm X, it would include Ali Shariati, it would include Fatima Mernissi, the Muslim feminist. There was a lot of scope. I mean, that syllabus has not yet been made. I hope it will be made, and I hope that it's interesting because he was initiating this dialogue as a person on the left who happens to come with a Muslim legacy, with me, a non-believer. I can't describe myself as a Hindu because I'm not born in a Hindu family, but who has no claim to religious affiliation, but remains deeply interested in religious questions and quests is a valid way of thinking about the world, right? And in the world. So this dialogue which is a kind of triangulation between faith, doubt, and the desire for freedom, for me was a very fascinating moment in time. And I miss the fact that we're not having that conversation.
Sure. Thanks. No, thanks for that. And sorry for the confusion earlier. So we are looking at two conversations where there is a desire for a new curriculum. One in 2015 and one in 2020. And these are two very interesting turning points in the politics of JNU, its activists. And the reason I say this is an important thing for all of us to consider is because some of the cutting edge conversations around politics and theories of change are happening in that campus, in addition to, let's say, a Hyderabad University and all that. So in 2015, you are making this transition from RDF to DSU. There's
from DSU
earlier,
to BASO.
2015 is when you're making this transition from RDF, which is the radical...
No. From DSU to BASO.
From DSU to BASO. So this RDF to DSU is happening in which time? So in 2015, there is this transition happening from DSU to BASO. And at the center of this conversation is the politics of love. And there's a section over here where, again, Shuddhabrata, this is your writing. You said, my friendship with Umar actually began with a long conversation on love, liberty, ethics, late one winter night in December 2015. He was still a student at JNU. I had spoken at JNU hostel meeting, and afterwards, Umar and his comrades asked me how I felt about their need to learn and explore a new language of sympathy and solidarity with the left. They wanted to articulate, they said, a politics that would respect, not shun desire and its complexity. So this is happening in 2015.
Yeah.
Where you're breaking fresh ground in terms of the conversation around what the new left should look like. Come 2020, so many things have happened, and you're looking for answers, like you just said, in this kind of liberation theology. Looking at theology as a tool for liberation in addition to what all you might have brought in already by way of Marxist understandings. And that's a rabbit hole I want to go in. Also while talking about Sharjeel, he's another person who did these explorations and things like that. I want to come back. So these are two important phases, I think, which will form an important spine in this conversation. But going into the sections again, Banojyotsna, you've been kind of quiet. Which section do you want to read?
I thought I'll read a part of Umar's writing. I mean, we usually read our own pieces, but we also make sure that a section of Umar's writings get read out.
Yes, please. Yes.
I'll read 2 paragraphs. It's around the questions that we were discussing right now.
Which page is this?
This is page 44. So this is from an unpublished letter by Umar. When we were writing the introduction of the book, we were in conversation with him also. We showed him that this is the introduction that we have written. What do you think? And if you have anything to add. So he wrote an extensive letter, and it eventually became 2 letters in response to what he is thinking right now about his world. And they were so good that we thought that they should be, he was not writing it for publishing, but it was very coherently expressed and articulated. So we thought that it might as why should we should let the readers also read what he is thinking, and it came out really well. So this is from the second letter, which is called The Possibilities That Lie in Front of Us. The consciousness of being persecuted and victimhood can lead us in different directions. It can lead us towards solidarity and unity with other oppressed groups to find the root cause of our present predicament, but it might as well lead us towards resentment, isolation, sectarianism, fundamentalism, and eventually self-destruction. The need for debate is important to ensure that the second option doesn't prevail over the first. So then, what is to be done? Over the last decades, a new consciousness is emerging among Indian Muslims. This is in response to several things: the rise of Hindutva fascists to the helm of power, the inability of the secular parties to resist either the Hindu right or to stand by the Muslims as they face increasing attacks on their lives and livelihoods, the complex inability of the traditional Muslim leadership, the Ashraf elites, to come to terms with the changed scenario, basically being out of touch with the socio-political scenario. Also, very importantly, the rise of Islamophobia globally after the events of 9/11 and the so-called quote-unquote war on terror. There are other contributing factors for this new emerging consciousness. One of them is technology, the rise of the internet and the later social media. Undoubtedly, big tech controls the internet and the social media platforms, yet it is undeniable that this has broken the monopoly of the who speaks for the Muslims. It is no longer the erstwhile traditional Muslim leadership who were in fact quite late to understand these technologies. As young Muslims navigate an exceptionally hostile climate and come to terms with the fact that they have been left high and dry by all those who claim to speak for them, they are now speaking for themselves. It is not coincidental that the first waves of protests against CAA, NRC, NPR came from this section of young Muslims studying in universities like Jamia, AMU, as well as other universities. New Muslim voices also include a sizable section of Muslim women, young and old, working professionals or homemakers, educated or not. And this remarkable development has rattled both the Hindu right and the erstwhile Muslim leaders. It has irked the Hindu right as they always view the Muslim women as passive victims of Muslim men whom the Hindu right was rescuing. It has also irked the erstwhile Muslim leaders where there were hardly any women.
There are so many provocations here, starting with what you ended with.
Yeah.
The women.
The new consciousness among the Muslims is something that Umar had been trying to map, had been trying to read, had been trying to reflect on and critically engage and debate around. So, I mean, once again, like the disclaimer that I gave at the beginning, that these were from his side, these were just incoherently put points, but these were just his fleeting thoughts that were there on his mind, but these are in his mind, definitely, these thoughts.
Yeah. And this mind is one that seeks to complicate each held position and is trying to break from something in the past, is what I get the sense from all of what is said about him and what he's saying himself. I have a section too which I want to read, which is also, close to my heart. Anirban, what section are you going to read?
I was also thinking, because one thing that we felt about the book and the reason why we carried these letters which were unpublished of Umar's as well, and in fact even one of the segments in the book which is called Conflicted Identities, is because the book in a certain way is also a testimony. It bears witness to Shaheenbagh, where it culminates, and it is also thereby an attempt to foreground not just individuals like Umar, Sharjeel, Khalid Saifi, who in fact is on bail for 6 months now, Gulfisha and the many others who have been sent behind bars. Of course, there is it naturally so happens that once there are people who are put behind bars, then a lot of the galvanization of the political voices happens around those people. That happens with Umar also, but thereby it is very important to also foreground the reason why they are behind bars, and there the context of Shaheenbagh, what it signified, what threatened the regime so much about Shaheenbagh, that the articulate voices, the young voices of the movement were put behind bars. And in that regard, it is also quite wholesome. It has been that every time we have been in Mulaqat with Umar, Shaheenbagh keeps cropping up, not as an event, but as to what it signified, and it's been playing in his mind. And in that, there is a process in his mind where things kind of culminate in Shaheenbagh, and it's about that process that he tries to historicize. I want to try to try to bring that aspect as to what is going on in his mind, where and why he thinks that the moment was so significant. So actually, he tries to grapple with a certain dogma of the left, where there is an instrumentalist approach towards questions of caste, gender, or even the Muslim minority question. In the broad left segment, of course, it doesn't translate beyond Ganga, Jamna, Tehzeeb and biryani and kheer and Eid. And
Hindustani music also.
Sorry?
Yeah, Qawwali.
Yeah, of course. So, and he tries to question that as to what are the lived experiences of Muslims in this country, and what is important over there is something that he underlines, is that there is no one lived experience of the Muslims in the country. So he is trying to put together, I'll just read selected paragraphs from this segment that he calls Muslim Response / Muslim Agency, the Past and Future Possibilities. After independence, the claim to being quote-unquote secular defined the party that ruled over India, that is Congress, and for it to be secular, there were always a few Muslims that it cherry-picked and then presented to the Muslim masses as their leaders. Who were these Muslim leaders? Either the clerical sections, the likes of Sharjeel Imam of the Jama Masjid, or there was another section, the super elite Muslims, who moved around in official circles with ease, but had no connect with or even interest in the ground reality of how the Muslims lived. In the official ideology of those times, a Muslim completed the idea of Indian nationhood, unity in diversity. But he did not so but he did so without receiving anything in return, without making any claims on the state, by simply effacing his own demands and issues, in fact, without even complaining when discriminated against. These were, quote unquote, the good Muslims, or the Sarkari Musalmans as he calls them, as opposed to the bad Muslims, quote unquote, the perpetual whiners, the ungrateful ones who did not learn from the perils of asserting their identity. Look, it led to partition. So, over the years, Dalits have spoken up and organized as Dalits. Backward castes have organized in the name of their caste groups to make demands of their state. There are also tribal parties that speak up for Adivasi rights by highlighting their Adivasi identities. As already pointed out, linguistic minorities forced the center led by Nehru to give in to their demands and reorganize the states on linguistic lines. But in a country where most of the politics and claim making happens in the name of community or some form of communitarian identity, Muslims are just not able to do so. They are not allowed to speak up as Muslims. It draws up imaginary fears of Muslim separatism. Far removed from the conditions in which majority of Muslims lived and happy with their share in the pie that the government gave them, the Muslim elite was never really interested in mundane questions such as constitutional safeguards for political representation or education and health, or questions of living conditions, or questions of wages, employment, etc. The only time it was really into action was when there was any attempt to reform personal laws of Muslims or on questions of Muslim women's rights, not just from outside but even within the community. It took to the streets, proclaimed that the Islamic faith was in danger, and the secular government immediately placated their fears by caving into their demands. Over the years, as quote-unquote secular elites were replaced by Hindutva brigade, and the official ideology changed from that of unity in diversity to Hindu nation, the class of Sarkari Musalmans has found itself displaced. It no longer enjoys the patronage that it once had, for the present dispensation wants no Muslims anywhere. The only exception where Muslims are hyper-visible is inside the TV studios, where these sections are brought center stage to caricature Muslims as a regressive, anti-woman, misogynist, fundamentalist community. Now, it is in this context that Umar highlights, that it's in this context that I want to place the Shaheenbagh movement. Though it began in the bleakest of times, when the Muslims were facing the threat of disenfranchisement, the manner in which it articulated its demands reflected a very intuitive mind. And let's not forget the fact that Shaheenbagh actually happened after a chest-thumping majority in 2019, when a large sections of articulate civil society segments of social movements were kind of cowered down, and there was a genuine atmosphere of fear. So in the bleakest of moment, actually this movement happens, of which he speaks of this intuitive mind. And it was remarkable because those leading this movement were not political parties, not seasoned politicians or even activists, but ordinary Muslim women who were taking to the street for the first time. Also students. It lasted for months before the pandemic forced the protest before the pandemic forced the protest to get called off, but it represented a possibility, a remarkable possibility, the possibility of a new Muslim subject that locates its oppression in a larger context, speaks a language of democratic rights, seeks allies across communities, and lays claim on history to make demands in the present. That's something that's also what Bruno was also reading, that segment where he tries to really mull over that moment again and again over these years as to what it represented and what are these possibilities that he thinks of. I'll just read one more paragraph where he says that some cynics ask, what have the protests achieved? And can they change Narendra Modi and Shah's plans? For the first time since independence, the Muslims of India have found a language, a new grammar of politics to articulate their pain and their aspirations. For the first time in the last 5 years of Modi rule, those who could not step out after each lynching, those who had to keep quiet after the unjust Ayodhya verdict, those who have been overtaken by fear and despair are speaking up. A muted community is speaking up for itself. The Muslim youth and women in these sit-ins today are more aware, more up-to-date, more informed, more critical, more conscious than the average Indian studying in the WhatsApp universities. This, for me, is the biggest achievement yet of our collective fight back. So, yeah, that I think is something that really is been occupying his mind. He's been thinking about it, and how does the progressive movement respond to these questions? How does the question of the Muslim subject find its place in the repertoire of resistance? In which something that, and I'm not reading that part, but something that he really highlights is also the fact that there's been an ignorance on the part of the progressive movement to actually see or read the Muslim community as also a largely working class community. A community that had an artisanal past, a community that had been dispossessed through deindustrialization in several phases, once in the colonial time, once post 91, and a large segment, a large part of that community actually, if thought about one way, identifies with a working class identity. I mean, if one reads it, but somehow in the language of engagement with this community, these don't feature. Treating them as active citizens, treating them as what they are, instead of this metaphysical identity in which either they are in the realm of qawwalis or the biryanis and things like that. So yeah, that's the part that I wanted to read.
Thanks for that. And I think if I should be able to take off from that to bring in the section that I want to highlight. This is right at the end in the postscript where he's writing this letter to Rohit. Right? And the reason this is interesting is because it kind of completes the circuit of thought for me in terms of why Umar is important to me as a journalist, trying to poke holes into these very strident branches of criticism against identity movement, so to speak. Right? For, and we might at this stage take some of these things as for granted, but back in even as recently as 2014, 15, 16, just immediately after Rohit's passing, this identity thing was still treated as, oh, that identity thing by the left. And that's how I started taking interest in this organization, BASO, because there's a left organization which is talking about Ambedkar. There's a Muslim character here who's speaking about identity in a very different way. And that's really my entry point into Umar. I used to speak with him quite often in that time. Every time I used to visit Delhi, I used to try and find a way to, pick a kind of an argument or debate with him, saying, iske baare mein kya lagta hai, uske baare mein kya lagta hai, and all of that. Fascinating character. So this, Dear Rohit, an undelivered letter from Umar. Just a couple of sections I want to read. You had a life which you yourself called a product of a fatal accident. But you also had an afterlife, Rohit. Not like the Brahmin's claims of being twice born, but an afterlife that lives on in the memory and defiance of those who choose the path of truth. You live on, thereby in the echoes of justice. For him to be able to articulate just that little thing, about an afterlife as opposed to the Dvija life, is just an, to us it gives an insight into the inner nuts and bolts of this person's mind. He says, I wish to speak, Rohit. I wish late into the night we could debate and decipher what went wrong in the life of this republic that we reached where we are today. How in this so-called, quote-unquote, Amrit Kal, justice for Dalits and Muslims in India remains elusive.
While I and other equal citizenship activists languish behind bars without trial for a crime I have never committed, those who were really responsible for the Delhi riots, the real rioters, remain not only unpunished but have also been elevated to positions of power. Right? So, this Dalit Muslim question, it is such an exciting thing to consider. Just as, Dalit Muslim left alliance, all of these, Neel Salam, Lal Salam, are exciting concepts. They excited a lot of us back then. And they also have petered out to a certain extent. Things seem to have kind of gone back to this, not talking about caste, not talking about the Muslim question. Recently we saw PFI being banned. That there is so much today by way of a certain kind of, let's say, mainstreamizing of, okay, Muslims can associate with this kind of politics. Once again, we're seeing that counter-revolution also happening in the discourse. So how do we enter this rabbit hole? I think this Ajaz Ashraf piece is helpful over there. And I love Ajaz's work. He's one of my favorite journalists. He talks about how in this transition from the DSU, and Bano and Anirban, primarily this applies to you guys, you were part of this transition, from DSU to BASO. What is BASO? Bhagat Singh Ambedkar Students Association. And Shuddhabrata, I hope you'll jump in wherever you can. And you have been part of this journey throughout as well. So, please make this a good little, banter, which all three of you can talk about it. So this DSU to BASO transition is happening over the question of how the traditional left deals with the question of love. Okay. Anecdotally, now play that out for me. What was happening? How did this happen? People out here also do understand, even in your own campus, after 2020, there's a break. So people don't know what was happening. What was happening back then? Who wants to start?
See, it is not the first time that in the left circles these questions were debated. These questions were debated ad hominem, repeatedly, raised by women, raised by people of other sexualities. Like that, the question of love, the question of sexuality, and most importantly, the question of consent, is very, very important. And to understand consent or the lack of it in sexual harassment, cases of sexual harassment, not to shield perpetrators of sexual harassment within the organization, and also not to criminalize love in the process, not to criminalize consensual desires in the process, to distinguish between the two, to distinguish between where there is consent and where there is not consent. To distinguish between the two also requires to take into account women's agencies, women's articulation of their love, their desire, their expressions of love, desire, and also to understand the uneven social development across the country, and therefore you cannot have a one-size-fits-all idea about love, about desires, and the evolution of these ideas. Has to be seen in a larger historical context, as well as with a certain kind of understanding individual agencies also. And it should not be looked with military discipline, how students organizations or workers organization or people working in the urban areas, how they are interacting, that cannot be criminalized. There, once again, consent has to be taken into consideration. So these are very old debates which the women's organization as well as the women in the left movement have repeatedly brought in.
No, see, I understand that these are old debates, but some of these terminologies, to my mind, are new. I mean, of course, if pardon my ignorance, if it's possible that I could not have picked up on it earlier, but to frame the conversation around patriarchy, now this is Ajaz reporting on what you guys were doing. So he's saying that the conversation in the DSF, in the DSU, sorry, is still stuck on this concept of cultural imperialism, as opposed to you guys introducing this concept of Brahminical feudalism. So this terminology itself, to my mind, if you're saying it's an old thing, it's an old debate, well, okay. But as a political journalist, I had never heard any left organization. I've covered left organizations from 2006 till about 2015. By 2015-16, I'd already covered 10 years of left politics. And I hadn't heard anybody use even the term Brahminical feudalism. Brahminism to chodi do. Feudalism fir bhi hai. Brahminism I've never heard. So tell me, is there some new evolution happening, or you were trying to revive old points?
We were trying to revive old points. The point is that when in the 90s, the women in the radical left movement were fighting about these points, they did not have social media. They did not have this, the technology that Umar says, that social media also empowers you to, take your voice towards people outside your designated circles. So they raised these points in party congresses. They raised these points in party conferences, in student organization conferences, where these were brushed aside and never reported in the party journals or, the students' organs. Because ultimately that is the fight of patriarchy, that the women were trying to find a voice. Luckily for us, when we raised this debate, and we had a fierce debates over years within the organization, and finally when we left, we articulated our points in 3 sets of pamphlets, and then put it up as posters, and also put it out in Facebook and other social media, from where it got printed in other radical journals, and it became an issue of debate. So we had that thing. But when we were writing, that is what I remember Kalpana Kannabiran writing in one of our mail chains, that, same points that we had raised, and it's coming back ad hominem. They had raised it in 1990s, in the early 90s. And obviously, our expressions, articulations will not be exactly the same, but the concerns were the same. The concerns were to look at, the agencies of women. The concerns was to understand and educate male and female comrades about the idea of consent. The concerns were not to criminalize desire and not to philosophize harassment. That was one of the major things that happened. That when it's coming to a case of sexual harassment, you're bringing in a lot of political philosophies and trying to philosophize and trying to brush it under, especially if it's a leadership person. But when it is coming to individual person's desires or articulation of desire, there you are criminalizing it as something, that is going to deviate the comrades from the path of revolution and bullshit like that. So that is what we were at that point of time fighting. And earlier also, and frankly speaking, these are in different ways, these are old debates. That's all.
You want to add to it? Yeah, Shuddhabrata, you want to add to it?
No, I think there's a broader question, which is that what is the role that desire and aspiration and autonomy plays within a revolutionary politics? Is the question of leading a good and a beautiful life something to be perpetually deferred to some abstract future? Or is it a question of seizing the initiative to live in a meaningful and beautiful way now, right? I've always thought of the Indian left's attachment to a certain kind of ethic of so-called revolutionary austerity to be a hangover of the ideals of brahmacharya. So it goes back to, these are all these there's a whole intergenerational cadre of men who profess their desireless selves, as if they have, and it's not just celibacy. It's a problem that the left also inherits from Gandhism, which is hung up on this question, right? So I am somebody who always thinks of Gandhi's insistence on celibacy as being an incredibly oppressive kind of dictum, which segues into his harassment of young women, which is in the later phase of his life. These so-called experiments of sleeping and so on. They are instances of harassment. And it's interesting to see this kind of the carpentry that cantilevers harassment on the one hand with this insistence on a kind of ascetic mode of asexuality on the other. So it's a problem at the heart of Indian politics and politics elsewhere as well. Can the revolution give place to individual autonomy and desire, or must it always be suppressed and then find some kind of underground channel, which is kind of a kind of sexual economy of demand and supply? Like there's always more demand when there's less supply, and so on and so forth. This is where it's at, right? And when I am watching this situation, what's incredibly important to me is that during the Shaheenbagh movement, amongst the young women who were declaring themselves now as subjects of history, there was this very remarkable articulation by a young poet, Nabia Khan. And she wrote and then spoke these lines at every meeting, which were emblazoned into my memory, which is Aayega Inqilab Pehen ke Churiyan Bindi Hijab. So it's a complete reversal and displacement of the myth of the revolutionary subject. What is the myth of the revolutionary subject in our milieu? It is the selfless male ascetic figure who gives and sacrifices his entire life to the cause. It goes back to Gandhi, it goes back to Bose. I mean, a lot of followers of Bose still can't deal with the fact that he actually married a woman and had a child, because it takes away from his celibate sacrificial self. To our current Prime Minister, who also kind of presents himself as a renouncer. So it's as if the bargain or the trade-off is that the male renouncer will do things that will benefit the greater cause. This is Brahminical kind of hypocrisy at its highest, right? In contrast to which, I think you saw the Shaheenbagh moment articulating a different kind of sensibility and disposition, which said that women of very different kinds, some who wear the hijab, some who don't wear the hijab, some who wear bindis and churis but not the hijab, some who wear churiya and the hijab, some who wear neither of these three things, they're all revolutionary subjects. And it also points, I mean, I have always insisted on saying that in our languages, the word inqilab doesn't gloss entirely only as revolution. When Hasrat Mohani used the word inqilab, he was doing it very, very thoughtfully. And remember, Hasrat Mohani is one of the greatest love poets of the 20th century in the Urdu language. He wrote poems as Radha addressing Krishna, right? He wrote that famous ghazal which everyone knows, Chupke Chupke Raat Din Aansu Bahana Yaad Hai, right? It's a love song, right? So inqilab in Persian goes back to the Arabic root qalb, which means the heart. And inqilab is the upsurge of feelings and currents within the heart. Without the heart, in our traditions, there is no revolution. So I think that this is a very interesting way, etymologically, or in the terms of the poetics of revolution, that something new began to emerge. And I think it has emerged. It has emerged in the lives and consciousnesses of a new generation, people call it Gen Z or whatever, who refuse to efface themselves. I grew up within a political milieu where we were told, you are not important. I don't think you can conduct revolutions by telling people that they're not important, their lives, their desires are not important. This is changing. And all of us, I think the reason why this small, minuscule organization, BASO, became what it was because of the fact that it was indexing change. When you're changing, you don't have to be, often you are ahead of other people, and therefore it takes a while for you to understand and to be understood. But I think that the reasons that gave way to the transition for my friends and comrades from one kind of politics to another is part of the crest of a much larger wave.
Absolutely. I just want to also add that you are very right in saying that I actually somehow feel, I do not know, I haven't been to campuses for some time apart from fleeting visits, but I also feel that these debates have been settled now. And I think, as you are rightly saying, we were at an inflection point where the old ghosts were still trying to rein in. And I think with the development of social media and all of that, I think the discourse has been taken over, and even the old ghosts who maybe have not budged, they do not have the temperament to now. Exactly. And in that, I feel, ultimately, where does this come from? You are very right in saying that somewhere inherent in that idea was this teleology of resistance that, first we will have class struggle, there will be liberation, and after that the women's question, the question, even that only the women's question, the question of other sexualities don't even feature, and the caste question, and exactly, and several other things will automatically get resolved, as if there is a lever you pull, and then after that there is just barish of liberation. What we tried to say that if we are dealing with these things as structural questions, then they are interconnected. And in that, to say whenever one is raising questions of gender, questions of consent, one cannot ultimately and raising those questions very, very structurally, and that suddenly when there are no answers to it, you find this lazy argument of Western imperialist cultural influences which are corrupting the minds and deviating them from the path of the class struggle, and thereby all these questions are in a certain way impediments in the way of the revolution. And as to solving it, once the revolution happens, everything will be solved. But our fear was that if the revolution is brought in this manner, then we are afraid as to what is going to happen about these questions post that.
The revolution will not happen.
Yeah, it won't happen if these. I'm old enough to remember that one of the stalwart women leaders of one of the major communist parties, who was she was like one of the leaders of the All India Women's Federation, said sometime in the early 90s that homosexuality was American imperialism. Nobody from that organization can dare to say that now. Right? So this is a distance that has been traveled, and thankfully it has been traveled.
True. And I in a certain way also connecting it with the book and his reflections is he had been actually for some time, even in his JNU days, getting increasingly anxious and frustrated about the same laziness that applied with the left in engaging with the Muslim question.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Right. Okay, now, when we talk about, how is the revolution coming, right? That's essentially, ultimately, the thing that you want to derive out of these kind of exercises when you're trying to figure out what is the path forward. And I take your point, Shuddhabrata, when you say that, there is this, you said what? This tendency in the left to say that you are not important, the collective is important, and the mass movement is important. Who are you, the individual, and subordinate yourself for the larger cause, and all of that. Now, I just want to, as a provocation, just flip that a little bit, perhaps to even look at some of the pockmarks of the present. You celebrated the Gen Z for how they celebrate their individuality. And one could, again, in the same breath, argue that there is a certain individualization of politics as well. And where it's you know, this this kind of funny phrase that one of my friends coined, which is, I am, therefore I am. I am, therefore I am, is a you know, is a at what point is it about difference? And difference is an important thing. When we talk about collectives, the collectives have to be a collection of differences, of different individuals who have. But, you know, you can also take it either concept to an absurd level. And these absurdities are things we have observed in the Gen Z, in these sudden upsurges of resistance. You know, but then the problem of this individualization also, would you consider, is a certain apolitical rhetoric that emerges from them. You know, a certain co-option of discontent. How do I put it? You know, this celebrity populism. And when I say this, I'm referring to the Balen Shah phenomenon in Nepal. You know, this rapper guy. You know, this actor guy in Tamil Nadu. What does he stand for? Goodness knows. Right? There were actors and rappers and comedians at your Bangalore event as well. God forbid one of them becomes the face of the revolution. Are we going to now have a comedian as the face of the revolution in India as well? You know, these are questions, you know, which have also become important as we speak about, you know, this thing of this disdain in the left for any kind of individual expression of difference. We have entered into a kind of complicated territory. We are seeing people who are not schooled in the mass movements, who have not participated in the mass movements, who have not worked on labor, who have not organized students, who have not organized women, Parakarmikas, or I mean, Safai Karamcharis. Anyway, you know, that basic spade work hasn't been done, and they have suddenly been thrust upon us by some algorithm. And this algorithm is something that we saw being at play even in 2016, you know, and it wasn't always pleasant. I mean, there were problems with, as we discovered later, with Shehla, you know, Kanhaiya joining Congress and all of that. The more popular they became, the less coherent their line became in terms of, where are they on the left question? So many of these things. I know I've said a hell of a lot of things over here. Let's unpack these questions. Who wants to go first?
You're absolutely right. I mean, I think that there is also a swing towards what I may consider to be a kind of narcissistic tendency, where for me it has to do with the selfie. I mean, the ability to insert the self as a self into the broad current of history and say, I am what I am, right? Exactly what you're saying. And there is a certain tendency within these situations for things to slip away into a relationship between some people who make that declarative presentation of self and the others who consume it, right? They become consumers of the greatness or the coolness or the with-itness of that person. But it's not a new phenomenon. I mean, look back to the mode in which the culture of what is called leadership is grafted into our consciousness, right? Now, I can understand that movements throw up charismatic individuals who then get sought by the media, by the discursive environment, by everybody as kind of placeholders of the imagination of everyone else. That also applies to a certain extent to Umar Khalid, right? We were at a reading where one woman said, but I don't agree with Umar on this or that or the other question. And I said to her, that's absolutely fine. Why do you feel pressured to be his follower. Actually, he is not asking for that. I am not asking for that. You are producing this predicament where you feel uncomfortable being the follower. Follower is a very Gen Z term, right? People who follow somebody's profile. So you're absolutely right insofar as that is concerned. But I think that much of this happens because of the fact that the question of the individual is not given any serious purchase, right? The relationship between organization and cadre, between party and member, between people outside formal organized politics and people inside formal organized politics. These are never given seriousness. I mean, I consider, if you look back at the traditions of the left globally, there is something called the First International. And the First International happens before a time where people solidify into parties, movements, leaders, right? I mean, Marx and Engels are members of the First International. They're treated with no difference vis-a-vis the other people. It's just a association of working people trying to think about the questions of capitalism, right? Perhaps a return to that spirit where we understand that there are different people with different capacities, with different skill sets, imaginations, who are all contributing to a thinking through of the question of what is to be done right now, right? That may be a step forward. I mean, I understand that the temptation of creating sort of little autocrats, whether it's Balin Shah or anyone else.
Actor Vijay, I don't know what he's going to turn into now.
Who knows? We don't know, right? But the point that I'm making is that these roles are also thrust on them by a social current and a culture that doesn't exercise its imagination enough. So it's not Balin who's necessarily become the leader. He's been made the leader, right? So then we have to consider what is this form? Where is it taking us, right? And I don't think there's enough of a conversation about that. I am interested in some of these moments of history, whether it's the Paris Commune or whether it's even the upsurge that occurred in Bangladesh, which went in all sorts of directions, right? It didn't end in directions that I would endorse all the time, or some of those directions didn't seem to be productive. But there are moments of turbulence and turmoil. Crowds appear on the street. They do things that are not part of the script of who they are considered to be. We need to give these moments a little more time rather than rush to, see what's coming out of them. I always like the phrase that was attributed to the one leader of the Chinese Communist Party that I have the greatest respect for, and it's not Mao Zedong, it's Zhou Enlai. He was once asked, what is the impact of the French Revolution? And he said, it's too early to tell.
We know that this uprising, even in the case of a Vijay or a Balan Shah, I don't know if I'm being contemptuous of the people by saying this, but the point is that perhaps they are not fully aware of the things that are pushing them in the direction of a revolution, the neoliberal context, the Western imperialistic context, the caste, race frameworks which are pushing them in that direction. I definitely see strains of that in the mobilization around actor Vijay.
Just to interrupt, what if they were doing all the right things, according to us?
What if?
I would still have a problem. What if they were doing all the right things, ticking all the boxes, not being part of the neoliberal whatever, expressing democratic sentiments, doing all the right things? It would still be a problem for me that we are articulating this moment in terms of the charisma of these people.
Interesting. Right. Yeah. Anirban, you were saying something, sorry.
No, I just wanted to also butt in and also kind of emphasize this point that the conversations that we have been talking about or we referred to, or many of these conversations that has happened over and over again in many of these left democratic spaces and progressive spaces, Ambedkarite groups and women's collectives, from the time of Kannabiran, as we were talking about till now, let's not forget that all of these discussions were actually happening within collective spaces. They were trying to assert and debate within a collective space. They were fine to be a minority opinion also, as long as you at least allowed the minority opinion to stay. But I think over the process of, I mean, of all these years, the question also, because I get like what Shuddha was also saying, that even if they were checking all the boxes, this is not something that that where we aspire to be, or where we see. Of course, it's as a historian, as a political activist, one needs to analyze and see with curiosity to every moment that is unfolding in front of us, and see what are the threads in it. That we are doing. But certainly I completely agree with the with the concerns that you raise about, is this the model? And I mean, I don't see that to be the model. I think it's a churning. We'll have to see, we have to act upon it. It's also not something that we allow to unfold as if and we see. So we'll have to act upon it. We have to see what are the forces that are leading to this. All of that is there. But at the same point of time, it is important that the progressive spaces, those collective spaces, also thereby learn to live with differences. They learn to engage with differences, and they don't push out any opinion that they feel is going to be what they term as, because those are, I mean, terms I can't believe that are still used in terms of, you know, renegades and counter revolutionary and things like that. So because if we do not have those spaces, if the left cannot hold debate, if it cannot
And also dissent.
and also dissent, if that space is not there, because actually all the reference points that we are referring to are not aspirants of individualism. They are aspirants of certain freedoms within a collective. And I think the collective also needs to learn and respect that, which I think is happening.
Yeah.
I sincerely believe that that inflection point is past to some extent, but it will nonetheless be a continuous struggle.
Yeah, I mean, just to return to the question of the prosecution's arguments vis-a-vis Umar Khalid, which I find fascinating, right? This question of leadership comes up again and again in the prosecution's arguments. And I want to try and make a distinction between a leader and the position of leadership. The position of leadership is the one of taking responsibility for a particular moment, right? Which many people do. Umar has done. He has often taken responsibility of trying to address a situation. Prosecution turns this into, is he or is he not the leader? Right? Because the entire architecture of its arguments against the people who are still in prison, Umar and Sharjeel, Khalid Saifi and Taslim have come out, and all the other co-accused, is that they constituted a kind of caucus. There's one statement by the public prosecutor that comes back to me again and again. And it's, an ordinary gentleman returns home from work and switches on the TV. The ordinary housewife cooks food in the kitchen, the children do their homework. Why would these people be compelled to go out onto the street and be a part of a demonstration, Shaheenbagh, right? Because it is these intellectuals, poets, writers who give them distraction and almost provide them with an entertainment that seduces them into politics. So what is the meaning of this? It means that the ordinary citizen has no agency, right? And it requires the intervention of someone like Umar Khalid to make them who they are. So, therefore, there is a WhatsApp group. Umar Khalid is a member of that WhatsApp group. He hardly ever posts. There is one instance where he posts in response to a police officer telling him that, let's calm things down. And he said, I agree, we should not answer this with provocation. We should not answer this provocation with escalation. We should try and find some moment of tranquility and peace so that these questions can be resolved. That's the evidence. Because the prosecution says, look, he's telling people not to escalate. Right? Yeah. Which means he's the leader. Right?
Oh, wow.
What is Umar Khalid?
And actually, it's a funny anecdote because I was smiling because this is the same incident I had in mind.
Yeah.
Where the evidence actually stacks up against the prosecution's argument because no one listens to him.
No one
listens to the leader. Quote unquote leader.
And I think Umar and Banojyotsna are at that time somewhere in rural Bihar. They're far away from Delhi. He's trying to respond to a certain message, and his silence his reticence on the WhatsApp group is also evidence that he's a leader, because he doesn't need to say things to get them done.
Silent whisperer or something.
Right? So here is a human being who is a witness and a companion to a lot of people trying to think through very difficult times. Right? There is nothing in our political imagination and our political culture that can give that position its dignity. What we have to do is to make him a Netaji, a Qaid, right? And that's a problem in the prosecution's argument. It's also a problem in the way that people idolize and eulogize human beings across the political spectrum. We are at an inflection point where a different ethic of response can be found, right? And it is being found. That's why you have people like Umar Khalid, Anirban, Banojyotsna. They're trying to be different kinds of witnesses to a turbulent time, trying to record their witnesses into history.
I think one of the first to actually say that I do not want followers was Ambedkar.
Yeah.
Even before the present idea of followers was there. And I mean, since you referred to the word Inqilab, I don't think that the audience would know as to it. This debate, I think, went on for 2 whole days almost in the court as to what the word Inqilab means. And because he said in his speech, Inqilabi Salam.
Inqilabi Istiqbal.
Yeah.
Welcome. Revolutionary greetings and welcome.
Yeah. What a waste of taxpayers' money.
Yeah. They said, why didn't he use the prefix Shantipurn Inqilabi Istiqbal? And the fact that he didn't means that he was preaching violence.
Yeah, in the same speech where he had referred to Shanti several times.
Yes.
Anyways.
Now, Banojyotsna, I want you also to come into this conversation about this individualization, these revolutions that are a kind of organic uprising that we've seen in different parts of South Asia. We saw this kind of consolidation in Tamil Nadu. So, one way of reading it, a lot of people ask about Vijay's victory. I'm a reporter down south. So, I want to look at the people as opposed to Vijay. The fact that the people made a secular choice. They were caught between these two options that they did not like. And the combination of things in their heads, which finally resulted in a consolidation for Vijay. It doesn't mean that Vijay necessarily is a progressive person or any of those things, but the mandate was a progressive mandate, is how I saw it. Now, in different cases, I feel that this mandate, right, of people uprisings, these people's uprisings, is quite progressive in its spark and things like that. But often we are not finding people to come and capture that moment and give it that kind of revolutionary direction. Like in the case of, revolution, we always go back to this thing of when it happened, Lenin wasn't in Moscow. He was somewhere else. And then he suddenly realized, the revolution is here. So he had to reach and then, give it direction. So now often we are finding that people's anger is coming out in various ways, but it's not getting direction. Any reflections on that? And then we'll get into the last section of this conversation.
Yeah. So, see, a lot of spontaneous movements have been taking place of late. For example, even when the CAA, anti-CAA movement, when it started, there were no leaders as such. There were no people who were sitting, unlike what the prosecutor has been propagating. It was actually a very organic movement that started, and in different places, it ultimately came because of different reasons. Like Shaheenbagh was in response to the Jamia Lathi charge, the Lathi charge that has immediately happened in Jamia, and how the university that this entire Muslim neighborhood holds very, very dear to its heart, and it holds in high regard. It was so brutally assaulted. Then that led to Shaheenbagh protest. But then, inspired from Shaheenbagh, a lot of protests other places in rural areas, in small towns, in big cities started growing. In Calcutta, the Park Circus protest started when JNU was attacked. And this repeated idea of, our children, our students getting attacked when they are asking for something right. So, it was out of that moral compulsion that it started. But once that movement started, the discussions that were going on wasn't anymore around just what has happened in Jamia and JNU. It was about citizenship. There were lectures. There were people who came, like Nivedita Menon came and gave a lecture on citizenship on the eve of 26 Jan. And there were 1,000 people who were sitting there and listening to her talking about, citizenship, rights of citizenship, the moral rights, moral duties of the state and the rights of or the common citizens. Now, there were extensive discussion about constitution. People came and read out the constitution multiple times and explained what each word means. So it was a very, very rich level of engagement that those anti-CAA movements achieved at that point of time. And had there not been the pandemic, it could have gone in a different way altogether. We don't know how it would have flared, these movements. Because they were engaging people ultimately across communities. There were solidarities that were being built across communities, and people were actually getting engaged, and the propaganda against the movements in the Godi media was failing. People were no more buying that, some people are unruly women of Shaheenbagh are blocking the road and creating traffic jam. That narrative was not so they were, but like the people were winning the narrative war, and then suddenly the pandemic came, and globally it put a spanner on the movement everywhere for everything. Now, then there was the Kisan Andolan, the farmers' protest. Once again, there were organizations which were involved, which were, charting out the course of action and the demands and everything. But there were also participation of many kisan, many farmers who were not part of organizations, and also, the kind of level of discussions that were taking place there also. It was very rich discussion about agriculture, about technology and agriculture, and people were having small discussions, focus group discussions within the Kisan Andolan. Also, what are these 3 laws and what are the implications? Thereby, what is liberalization, neoliberalization? So, many things which the Kisan संगठन जो वो मतलब अब तक लोगों तक पहुंचा नहीं पा रहे थे कि द इंट्रूशन ऑफ कैपिटल इन एग्रीकल्चर, उसका क्या फॉल आउट है. इन दिस प्रोटेस्ट स्पेसेस those discussions could take place, and the people who went back from those protest places were richer in knowledge, richer in information, because so many people of so many different thoughts came together and had those discussions in that entire border of Delhi. So my point is, when this kind of movement, so these movements have been happening. These are two movements that I cited, which were not organized, which were not started by organized forces, which organically started, but they proliferated in very rich ways and enriched not just the people. Like, for example, during the Kisan movement, we were also talking, like the ordinary people were also talking about what exactly is the, Kisan farmers are fighting for. So now my point is that these two movements have also happened. Now, the other movements that take place, so for example, right now in Noida, we saw the workers' movement. And that movement was the protest. The protests were chaotic, and the protests were basically an eruption of very long-standing grievances of workplace conditions of the Noida workers, which erupted in a way. Okay. And now there are repression. But the thing is that it's not like people there are not talking amongst themselves. People are talking, and different, even in these protest places, different factories and their workplace conditions, which they don't otherwise discuss. Here, during the protest, these discussions are taking place. So, individualization that you were talking about, in a way, always gets countered in this kind of collective protests. And what we learn from this protest enrich us as participants, as whoever is participating. And whoever is participating are also important. What I'm saying is that even if, say, like what Umar also said, what has this protest achieved? This is a very common thing, that what has this protest achieved? The protests enriched the protesters. That is what it has achieved. Even if they could not cut across although the anti-CAA movement was doing, anti-CAA movement was reaching out to the larger society as well. And even if the Noida protesters could not cut across the middle class or the other sections of the oppressed sections, the protests enriched the protesters itself. So they are not the same. Like you said, like Vijay, whatever it is, it was a progressive mandate. His politics, whatever dubious it was, he came with a vision which the people agreed to, and which the vision was definitely a progressive vision. And it encouraged dialogue within Tamil Nadu. It encouraged dialogue, people to speak out and even debate that how is this better than, than the DMK rule, which is actually one of the best state governments that India had. Like, with its performance statistics, it's one of the better state governments that India had. And even that state government could fall because people in Tamil Nadu at least were talking, and there was a kind of a debate. Even if it turns out that, that was a misjudgment and an error of judgment, collective error of judgment, it's not like the entire democratic dialogue will fall. There will be more dialogues here. And that in itself, I believe, is very important, and which we often... So it is not, when I'm saying that when people are protesting, it is not like they cannot remain as individuals. Some kind of, they are going beyond their individuality, and when they're coming out in collectives. And our traditional ways of collectivization, those are also changing. And that also we need to understand and, introspect.
Thank you for those reflections. I think now we'll get into the last section. You guys are running out of time as well. So, this Muslimization of Umar, you guys have known him more intimately. I have known him, every time, like I said, I would bump into him here and there, and he's somebody who has a variety of interests, a range of opinions on things, and this thing of boxing him into his Muslim identity. But the moment we talk about that, I can't help but think about another character who has suffered a little differently, but also as part of the same Islamophobic framing, Sharjeel Imam. Right? Sharjeel Imam was somebody who, at least in the beginning, his name used to be part of civil societies, in their pamphlets, in their posters about people who've been arrested by the regime. His name would appear. Slowly, his name disappears from these conversations. There is a certain discomfort with the kind of Muslim politics that Sharjeel is putting forward in different progressive movements. I know, like in the South, Sharjeel is a no-go thing, topic, or Sharjeel's kind of politics is something that they don't want to engage with, and this discomfort is kind of, in a sense, common to people who. I mean, it runs as a common thread between characters such as not just Sharjeel. You have a Sharjeel, you have a Abdul Nasser Madani. You in a sense, perhaps even the Oasis. Any kind of articulation of Muslim politics from Islamic positionalities is seen as problematic. In the case of Sharjeel, when you look, Umar is talking about Ambedkar, Marx, and Birsa. Sharjeel is talking about Ali Anwar. Right? He's talking about Pasmanda politics. He's talking about Islam as the path to liberation, an anti-left position, saying that the left has always subordinated the Muslim question and things like that. How do you see this invisibilization of Sharjeel? I've read his writing, a brilliant person, a progressive person. Also, Ali Anwar is who? Ali Anwar is somebody who actually, to my mind, decommunalized the Muslim question, saying that hum Shudra pehle hain, Muslim baad mein hain. This is the person who questioned the RJD's form, brand of secularism by saying that you've only given seats to Ashraf Muslims, and they are the only people who have some kind of power in your cabinet, in your government, and all of those things. So this is Ali Anwar, and Sharjeel is trying to, let's say, update some of this to bring into focus the people who are the most vulnerable in that CAA NRC conversation, the largest ethnic minority in the northeast of India, the Bengali Muslim, whose identity is a combination of class, caste, so many other things. So this character is not, I'm trying to use my words carefully here. He's not an Islamic fundamentalist. This chicken's neck thing also that they attribute to him. It was supposed to be any kind of a chakka jam. We have seen so many chakka jams. It was supposed to be, and then it was projected as, he wanted to separate the northeast from India from the chicken neck and things like that. All of these tropes have somehow, by the silence of civil society to Sharjeel's question, have almost become as given, understood. He was a separatist kind of a character. Sharjeel Imam, guys, individual responses. Who wants to go?
Yeah, I can go first. I think to start with, one has to reckon with the fact that there were many voices, as we have been discussing. Shaheenbagh was not an organized, regimented, unidirectional movement. There were many voices in it, as it should be within any mass movement, and in which there were different people with different ideas about it as well. As to how the movement shaped other things around it, and that is what we had. I mean, taking a cue from the earlier thread of the discussion that we were having, is that in the same way one is observing a movement unfolding in front of us and acting upon it. In the same way, the movement also, in return, shapes organized politics around that, who are also participants in it directly or indirectly. Say, for instance, one of the things that Shaheenbagh threw onto the stage was the constitution or the preamble, and we saw that a large part of the opposition right now carries this small pocketbook of the constitution, and which in a certain way is a legacy of Shaheenbagh, whether they recognize or not. But this gamut of things that Shaheenbagh was composed not by one individual or two individuals or a bunch of or one particular ideology, and like I said, as it should be. And I think Sharjeel, Umar, Gulfisha, Khalid Saifi, there are so many participants, so many voices, and all of them have, within the larger rubric of a democratic society, the imagination that Shaheenbagh had of a democratic society, of a society where there is equality, that was the larger message of the movement. It was an inviting space. In that, there are people who had differences, and it is the question over here is that are we, if within the civil society we are not able to handle differences, and if within the civil society we are not being able to engage with differences, then I think that is a disservice to Shaheenbagh. So I think, say for instance, if we speak about Sharjeel, notionally speaking, say for instance, if one goes by simple facts, if the case, I mean, of course, it's a flimsy, mindless case that has been manufactured, which I think the public prosecutor themselves know, against all of them. But even amongst all of them, if there is somebody whose case stands most absurd, is actually Sharjeel, who is actually in jail when the riot unfolds. And it is somebody, things that are attributed to him, which keep finding its references back through the fissures and crevices of the prosecution's argument till date, are references to cases about which he has already been acquitted. I mean, in the sense he has been cleared. So, in a certain sense, there is a certain manufacturing of a particular personality that the state is doing. As civil society, as progressive voices, I sincerely believe that it is a disservice to Shaheenbagh if we are unable to see through that. And also it is only matured and it is only democratic to actually acknowledge the fact that yes, I may agree with certain views, I may have certain qualified differences with certain other views, but at the end of the day, if we are talking about a democratic mass upsurge, they are all voices within the spectrum, and this spectrum is a democratic spectrum. And I think in several speeches of Sharjeel, he refers to in very grainy details about constitutionality and how to remain within the bounds of constitutionality. So I think one needs to engage with that question. Umar, I mean, if we are thinking about Umar, like you yourself said, in his idea, it was, and even the portion that I read, in his idea, the movement ought to be a harbinger of more and more alliances. It needed to be harbinger of democratic exchanges. Even with differences, it ought to open up spaces where, and isn't that the most beautiful thing? I mean, at the end of the day, we were referring to the time when we were talking about Lal Salam and Neela Salam and Jai Bhim Lal Salam actually. And it is because in a certain sense, certain questions were the thrust upon the left progressive sections that they had to understand it first of all, grapple with it, and question some of the understandings that had been weighing heavily on them as to how do we understand the question of caste. So similarly, there are questions that are thrown up by various actors, and I think in Umar's idea it was about synthesizing them. It was about coming up with a dialogue, with a space of dialogue where there is a space for all of these disagreements, in most importantly coming from his trajectory, be it from his politics, be it from his dissociation from a particular kind of politics to another. In his trajectory, it's also a constantly evolving people, and that is important to recognize that all of these people whom we are talking about, be it Sharjeel, be it Umar, are constantly evolving minds. And in Umar's mind, it was important that even for the minority question, for him to address, and the thing that we were talking about, the laziness of the left, for the minority question, he genuinely believed that it is a question that is intrinsically linked with the question of democracy in the country, and thereby it is a question that ought to be answered only through building alliances with other oppressed classes and oppressed castes, in which the Adivasis feature, in which other oppressed genders feature, in which the oppressed caste, the Dalits feature. And I think that is what was being communicated. I mean, in his mind, that is what the movement communicated. And as Shuddha was saying, that those people whom the public prosecutor thinks are mindless people, you would remember the day, and in fact, we also remember the day when Radhika Vemula came, and the day Jignesh came, and Umar was there. And Najib's mother
shared
came.
some photos from that day with you and Banojyotsna today, this morning.
Exactly. You had shared photos of that day. That crowd, the electric crowd, did it. Exactly. It was Republican. And that electric crowd, did it think like they do not know what is going on the stage and the alliances that is inherent in it? I think they were a much informed crowd, and that's what Umar believed in. And and in that building of alliances, in that idea of the republic. So that's I'm saying that in that broad spectrum there are many voices, and I think we need to acknowledge all of these voices for what they bring on the table, and then there is an open space to debate that out. But to think that one is a quote unquote pariah, I think that is disservice to the movement.
Shuddhabrata, the invisibilization of Sharjeel Imam?
Sure. I mean, but I want to go back to the way you started this question, your prompt. The Muslimization of Umar and of Sharjeel, different ways. But I want to ask a question. Do we ever say Kanhaiya Kumar is being Hinduized? Do we ever ask of what is Rahul Gandhi doing as a Hindu leader? I mean, although he is quite frank about his Hindu faith. I remember that speech he made in Parliament where he took an icon of...
So is Kanhaiya actually. He's constantly giving references from Ramayana and all of that.
Exactly. But that is what is available to him to give. And why shouldn't he, right? But this does not turn into a question where we are saying, oh, but there is a Hinduization of Kanhaiya Kumar. And I think that the question of the Muslimization of Umar Khalid and or Sharjeel Imam or any of the others rests on a slightly disturbing fact, which assumes that the default subject position in this country is a Hindu subject position and an upper caste Hindu subject position. Therefore, it need not be named, right? So anybody else who articulates a political position, a philosophical thought, sentiment of whatever it is, has to have the prefix of who they are attached to them. And if Sharjeel Imam and Umar Khalid are Muslims, it also points out the fact that they're very different kinds of Muslims. So the assumption is that you don't have to be talked about as a Hindu because Hinduism is your private faith, and unless you are some kind of Hindutva lunatic, your Hinduism is of no consequence, right? But so when we see secular leaders becoming Hindutva leaders, like Himanta Biswa Sarma or Shubhendu Adhikari, they were all part of the broad mainstream secular politics. They Hinduized themselves in a very significant way. But otherwise, other people, what's our Assamese political leader, Gogoi, Tarun Gogoi, nobody calls him a Hindu leader, right? Nobody even calls Mamata Banerjee a Hindu leader. There's an interesting discussion that's happening right now about Vijay, that he's Christian.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But if he were not, nobody would have discussed this, right? So, that's a very important point to talk about. The fact that you get presented as a Muslim because you're not conforming to the default universal category. It's like in Hindi cinema, if you were a Muslim character, I would always lay a bet with my friends, ye kab marega? Because being a Muslim, he has to sacrifice himself and take the bullet which saves the hero or the heroine. And this is a role that A.K. Hangal used to play very well. He was always becoming the dying Muslim. Sholay se lekar pata nahi kab kiya hai. So, there are certain defaults that get articulated like that. Then the question of what kind of Muslimness or what kind of Islam are we talking about? And those are up for discussion and thinking. They are not the same. Sharjeel Imam's presentation of his Muslimness is not the same as Umar Khalid's exploration of what it means to think as a Muslim. Interestingly, Sharjeel Imam's presentation of the Muslim question, in my understanding, limited as it is an entirely sociological one. It rests on the social character or the social stratum of the Muslim subject in India, that there is a certain kind of disempowerment that has happened and so on and so forth. Umar, although he is not silent about that question, is actually also interested in what I think is a much deeper philosophical, theological core. So there's this paradox of the fact that Sharjeel is presented as the more Muslim character, whereas actually he doesn't think, nothing in his political statements talks about what is Islam. He talks always about who is the Muslim.
Exactly. Yeah. Thank you for that. Yeah.
What is happening to the Muslim. Umar Khalid, on the other hand, has begun to think about how do we deal with the legacy of Islam, the spiritual, philosophical, cultural legacy of Islam. So, who is more or less Muslim? That's not a measurement that I am going to actually exercise.
Mm-hmm. No, we shouldn't.
Right?
Yeah.
We should not.
Yeah.
But the fact is that if one sees the Muslim subject as a constitutional unit, and as Anirban said, Sharjeel is very passionately concerned with the question of constitutionality, which is very different from the Indian constitution. He means a mode of liberal politics, which is what he's committed to. How to create a space for, frankly, a liberal democratic politics that is not interested in mass movements or upsurges. He's actually not interested in that. In fact, he categorically asked for and demanded as a leader that the Shaheenbagh movement be wound out.
Yeah, I remember that. Yeah.
This
He
was
called
in
it,
late December.
I mean, not narcissistic,
A
something
picnic
like
spot.
Vanity
Picnic
project.
spot.
Yeah.
A picnic spot
Picnic
for
spot, vanity project.
people. And at the core of that is a certain discomfort with what people do when they take initiatives politically. Right? And his statement also indicated a certain kind of loss of control that he wished to assert. On the other hand, you saw Umar Khalid celebrating the fact that this was becoming a confluence of very different kinds of people. I have never had anything against picnic spots. I think they're great, right? And if anything, one of the most phenomenal conditions that happened in Shaheenbagh was when the future representatives of the farmers' movement came to Shaheenbagh to do what? To start a kitchen. They changed the grammar of politics in Shaheenbagh and in the farmers' protest by saying, we've had enough of hunger strikes, I can't stand them, right? But let's have feasts and langars. So again, going back to the question of how do we imagine politics, right? Now, is there a space within a Muslim, Islamic, theological situation of thinking about food and the sharing of food? Of course there is. What is the entire tradition of khanqahs and Sufi shrines in this country if it is not wedded to the question of an open-ended hospitality? That is why it is radical. It doesn't ask who is being fed and who is feeding them. It simply
Breaking
assumes...
bread together kind of thing is a very big...
Absolutely. Yeah. And that hunger is a fundamental human disposition. It needs to be addressed. We don't ask who is hungry, right? Now, I would say that is a serious religious question. I am not a religious person, but I am very fascinated by the fact that religion always produces these questions. Who is asking that question? Of the two, who is asking that question? It's an important thing to think about. They're both. I'm not saying that one is more or less sincere in their faith or in their doubt. But I'm just saying that these are different expressions. The assumption that one is a leader, and the word that Sharjeel often used was the very evocative Urdu word qaid. Qaid. That's leadership. Umar always spoke the language of the sathi. Or we have other words for it in Urdu, Rafiq, the comrade, right? Are you ahead or are you with? And when the people you're ahead of disappoint you, what do? Do you turn around and say, ho gaya bas? Or do you take the question forward? So, while I, first of all, have some doubts and caveats to the question of Muslimization, then my second response is that which kind of Muslim, which kind of Islam, right? Now, I have no problem with the expression of faith or spiritual legacies in political terms. If you didn't have that, you wouldn't have a Martin Luther King. You also wouldn't have a Dr. Ambedkar, right? In the end, Dr. Ambedkar's legacy is also one of the rediscovery of what is a religion, Buddhism, right? Now, we can't be embarrassed about that fact. That's true. That's where it is. I may not be a Buddhist, but I'm deeply interested in the questions of an emancipatory tradition within Buddhism.
With a focus on materialism, I mean, yeah.
Yes, there are traditions that are not emancipatory. There are traditions within Islamic history that are emancipatory, and there are traditions that are not. Right? But without an exploration of these facts, we cannot determine our relationship to the question of faith or doubt. And that's where I leave it, It doesn't matter to me whether people speak in an idiom that is religious within the Muslim cultural context, just as it does not matter to me that people speak in an idiom that is, let's say, Buddhist or Christian or Vaishnavite or Shaivite or Lingayat in Karnataka. Some of the most emancipatory processes within, let's say, where you are, your state, Karnataka, come from the Lingayat tradition. That's a faith-based tradition. Now, but like the chief minister of Karnataka gets spoken of as Lingayat only when it comes to the question of a vote bank. But nobody talks about the fact that Gauri Lankesh was deeply invested in Lingayat history.
Absolutely, yeah.
And that not because it was a vote bank, but because it brought a philosophy.
Even in the farmers' movement, it was a very common slogan to give Bole so Nihal Sat Sri Akal. They were fighting as farmers, but they were giving the slogans, and even left leaders were participating and giving that slogan. But if the Muslims give Allahu Akbar, then it becomes like an absolute no-go zone. Like,
But Bano, just now, I mean, you're going to have the final comment here on this question. I just want to once again, want you to kind of rewind and start this answer from the beginning. Again, we're talking about what? We're talking about religion having played out in different ways in the course of the last few years that we've seen mobilizations against Modi. How do I put it to you? Let's say, okay, in the crowd that we saw at BIC, I know them individually. This is my city. I've been here all my life. And I know them enough to know that they would be very uncomfortable with what Sharjeel stands for. And now, as Shuddhabrata and Anirban talked about, I mean, there is so much texture there. There is so much, by way of, if you really have, you want to take a progressive line, let's even say, there is enough in Sharjeel's work to show that he is a constitutionalist. He's, talking about democratic solutions. What is the discomfort with this character? What's your sense? And yeah, because there's so much in common that Sharjeel and Umar have. They're from the same university, the same department also, coincidentally.
No,
History
is it?
department.
Yeah, the same.
Yeah.
yeah, same department.
Same department, yeah. And the same department has responded differently to these two individuals that they've produced. The professors over there, starting from that.
See, I think we all get stuck in the cults that media make, like the positive cults also, like suddenly a cult that media makes, and also the negative portrayals, like what Shuddha said, that there are much more nuances to the Muslimness as well as the Islamic vision or vision about Islam of Umar and Sharjeel. But no one is going into those nuances. In the Godi media, Sharjeel is portrayed as this deranged lunatic fundamentalist, and drawing from that, and the thing is that what like he said that the default in our state in this country is the consciousness, is the basically the Brahmanical consciousness is considered as the mainstream, right? Is the default, and therefore, unfortunately, the Godi media's narrative has also mainstreamized itself. The criticality is only till a point. So, the idea of like my point is that Sharjeel, has he given any call for violence? No, he has not. What he was talking about, why he has got bail for all the places where actually the chicken neck incident was, there were FIRs on that chicken neck speech. He has gotten bail from all the cases, all the FIRs that were filed. Because did he actually go and cut off the chicken neck? Was he giving that speech in the chicken neck itself? He was speaking in Aligarh in front of a few students who were having a nighttime thing. See, I mean, people talk all kinds of things in universities. That's what universities were for. To have all sorts of ideas, to take the notion of imagination boundless. That's what universities were for. And he said, he gave an idea, he talked about something that Kanhaiya shouldn't have left. He should have एक चक्का जाम करना चाहिए था और चिकन नेक से वहाँ पे पूरा चक्का जाम कर देता तो
सरकार पे दबाव बनता.
हाँ, दबाव बन जाता. Now, first of all, in itself, it is not wrong, whatever he is saying. Because Chakka Jam is what the entire farmers movement did. Chakka Jam is like repeatedly farmers movements, Ganna Kisan, even the many other civil society, the civil disobedience movement in this country has done.
Chakka Jam is picketing. No, picketing. It's like
picketing. Yeah,
is the most basic
it's
form
the
of
whole thing.
Protest. I mean,
In Jammu, the BJP asked for chakka jams, and it is the other chicken's neck.
Yeah, so
The Sialkot Jammu
Yeah.
highway, that is supposedly a chicken's neck.
So the thing is that there is nothing wrong in what he has said, but we don't go into nuances because Godi media doesn't go into nuances. So another thing that what like the other difference is, like, if Sharjeel thinks that all the secular parties have betrayed the Muslims, they have used the Muslims as a community, and therefore I am not going to go into any dialogues with any other parties. Muslims should find their own battles in terms as Muslims. That's a democratic opinion to have. Like, I don't think it's anything different from what Asaduddin Owaisi says or many other Muslim leaders say. So I might not agree with that approach, but that is an absolutely legitimate thought to have within the democratic spectrum. So, but that is what, na, by default we are Hindus.
Actually, that is, yeah. I mean, by, point to the irony of this conversation itself, it is by design deliberately that we don't have a Muslim in this conversation, because some of the things that we have said, we can say because of our identity, despite whatever marginalities we may also come into this conversation with, it is still safe for us. So for an Umar or a Sharjeel conversation, we are literally the trope. As opposed to, yeah. Shuddhabrata, you want to say something?
Yeah, I just want to say one brief thing. One is that one of the conversations that Umar and I had was reading a text by Hannah Arendt, where she talks about the fact that if you are being oppressed as a Jew, you have to respond and fight back as a Jew. And it is the same Hannah Arendt who becomes one of the most radical critics of Zionism, right? As a project, as an ethno-nationalist project. She doesn't ever say, I am not Jewish. She always says, I am responding to oppressions against Jews as a Jew, right? And I think Umar and I discussed this also in the light of a text by Marx, which is quite misunderstood on the Jewish question, where he says the society will not be rid of the Jew until the time that the Jew is not rid of society. It's a fascinating, it's one of those kind of dialectical paradoxes that he really enjoyed playing with. But what is he saying? He's saying at heart something to do with the fact that until the relations that exist between Gentiles and Jews are not annihilated, until that time the question of who is Jewish and who is not remains. Right?
And that's
it's
a
very
question that
similar
goes back
to
the
what
time of Jesus, really.
Yeah, and it's a very similar question to what Ambedkar talks about. He does not talk about the reform of casteism. He talks about the annihilation of caste.
Of a state of mind.
Of the state of mind, and also of the category of caste as a means of organizing not just society but thought. Right? So that's a very important distinction. There is also an important distinction reflecting on this, which is a distinction between the two philosophical backgrounds and positions that these two very gifted, intelligent young men come from. I've known Umar more. I've known Sharjeel a little less. I applaud his analytical capacity. However, I have a fundamental philosophical difference, which is something that I think that, and I have talked about this, that might be open to discussion, which is you referred to the idea of what does it mean for a Muslim to say Allahu Akbar, Nara Takbir, Allahu Akbar. I see no problem with a political rally in which this slogan is raised. Somebody like Shashi Tharoor once said, If they are so worried about the constitution, why are they using the terms Allahu Akbar? Right? Completely a highly discriminatory, I would even say Islamophobic comment, spiteful. This is the best of our secular political intelligence here. However, there is something that Sharjeel Imam said in that same speech in Aligarh, which everyone focuses on the chicken's neck question. He said, and there is a recording, it exists, I've listened to it time and again. He said, the only people who can be on the barricades with us are people who say, Nara-e-Takbir, Allahu Akbar. That's a very different position from saying, yes, we must be able to say Takbir, Allahu Akbar. But if you say that the position on the barricade only belongs to one confession of faith and not anyone else, that the question of solidarity does not exist and should not exist, right? I am all for people asserting emphatically their Muslim subjectivity. But does, as we said, the Constitution of Medina, the Covenant of Medina, the legacy of the Prophet Muhammad, or his last speech where he says there are no Arabs, there are no Ajams, there are no men, there are no women, right? The category of the Muslim is not yet constructed as a definitive thing. Those statements, whether it's the Covenant of Medina or the last sermon of the Prophet, point to solidarities, and solidarities only make sense between people who are not the same. You cannot have solidarity with your family. You can only have solidarity with strangers. There is a hadith of the Prophet who said, Islam comes into the world as a stranger, and it is as a stranger that it will leave the scene. So, do you have room in your politics for strangers, or do you not? And which is the correct Islamic position on this? I don't have an answer to it, but I have a question.
Wow, thank you. This thing of when you talk about Sharjeel's articulation, right? Okay, I'll come to this by way of conclusion. But Banojyotsna, you had some thoughts you wanted to get off on the same thing. I cut you off. Sorry. Yeah.
Same thing. I was just saying that I might not agree with like what he said at the end, like that kind of approach of Sharjeel. But I would always say that he has the right to profess.
He has the right to profess
that idea and to his own people. I mean, we will not be on the same side of the barricades. We'll be standing side by side, maybe. There will be a gap, but we'll be on the same side of the barricade. But there might be a gap. But I don't care. I mean, he still can stand there and profess his thought.
Exactly.
And he should not be demonized for that.
Yeah. Exactly. What Shuddha also was saying, like, in that sense, what is very important over here to highlight also is that solidarity is a higher virtue than agreement. And I think that is because you can be in solidarity with people whom you don't agree with.
Yeah.
And in that, I also think, but that's the thing. In that spectrum of Shaheenbagh, all these thoughts were democratic thoughts and they had the right to exist. That's the idea.
Right. No, I'm just trying to give Sharjeel a little bit of benefit of doubt over here. This is something that made a lot of us uncomfortable at that point where solidarities were developing, and as were the cracks in them, the fractions, the different isms that were sometimes grating against one another. In all of this, and I come here from a Dalit Ambedkarite perspective and trying to understand it from that perspective, it is often, it's quite common in Dalit assertion to say that for too long have others spoken for us, we wish to plead our own case. And if that is the political position, in the polemics of delivering a speech, it can translate into we deserve to be the first ones on the barricade. We are the first line of defense and things like that. And here I'm making huge leaps of assumptions, saying Sharjeel perhaps was referring to this? And why not, if you stretch that thought further, why not? Why wouldn't he talk about it in these terms? Because of this kind of appropriation that happens, this kind of flattening out, cutting up this Muslim question, Dalit question, woman question, queer question into bite-sized, digestible pieces, right? By people who are not from those marginalities. Often that's the discomfort, right? That you don't come from a certain marginality and you still seek to represent. And in response to that, perhaps some of these things may come past the mic, can turn into, we are the ones who want to stand in the barricade, we don't need any solidarities. Might be just a polemical provocation. This is something I'm throwing up to you guys. Do you want to think about it finally?
True. I'll just say one thing. The month of Muharram is going to come soon. Soon. And in the days of Muharram, one observes different moments of different days. The 9th of Ashura is the day before the death of Imam Hussain and the martyrdom of the 72 of his companions. On the 9th of Ashura, Imam Hussain says, even if you do not believe as I believe in Islam and the traditions of the Prophet, you can still join me in the quest for freedom and justice. It's a very important statement, even if you do not believe. And he's addressing the people who are opposing him. Right? Now, for me, this statement has always meant that I, an unbeliever in any religion, have a space in the battlefield of Karbala. I can be with Hussain, as there were Christians, as there were Jews, as there were even people from the Mohiyal Brahmins from Punjab were there. Their tradition is that they were the defenders of Imam Hussain. That's a question. That's an image of intersectional solidarity of different kinds of people that I think is deep within the heart of the Islamic heritage. It gives me space. I don't think other heritages give reciprocal space, but at least this one does.
That should be followed by silence and a thank you for being with us. Banojyotsna,
Thank you so much for having us.
Time. Thank you for coming all the way to the studio. Anirban, Banojyotsna, I really hope we're going to get another chance to have this conversation. Shuddhabrata, your scholarship is overwhelming. Thank you so much for your insights. We'll have this conversation once more, I hope. Thanks for now.
Yeah,
Thanks
sure.
for being on What's Your Ism.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks for having us.